Sure. My name is Craig Rucker. I am the president of the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, or CFACT. CFACT is an organization that's been around since 1985. We work on issues of environment and development. We have a free market perspective and one that also advocates for sound science, which makes us a little different than some of the other environmental groups which we would claim have a more big government or liberal viewpoint. I started up this organization back in 1985 for the purposes of trying to bring a reasonable voice, or a voice of reason, I guess you could say, to the environmental cause.
The overarching theme of the documentary is how these globalist agendas in the UN and the WEF translate into real, concrete, on-the-ground policies in different countries.
I've been involved in this issue going back to 1986, really, and this is a time when sustainable development actually started to take off, when Gro Brundtland, the Premier of Norway, coined the term sustainable development in a book called Our Common Future. A few years later, the UN met in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 and actually signed a document called Agenda 21. This document, which was signed by leaders around the world, was supposed to be a non-binding document, but contained in it principles of sustainable development and how they are to be implemented on the local level. An organization was also created around that time called ICLEI, the International Council on Local Environmental Initiatives. Its purpose was to try to implement these laws on the local level. ICLEI chapters sprung up around the entire United States with the purpose of doing that. And they work with commissioners in local towns and cities to try to implement sustainable objectives into them, and they've been incredibly effective. So that is how they're actually being put into law around our country. There's a whole vast network of NGOs that are out there all working to put what are now 17 Sustainable Development Goals into law in the local region, in the local municipalities, townships, state law, etc.
Starting in 1992, this idea of sustainability began to get implemented. If you can just simply trace it down from 1992, how did we get to 2022? Can you give the big milestones?
To give you the milestones that are before, because it wasn't like it came out of the blue in 1987. This was a thing that grew out of first Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s, had a book called The Population Bomb, where he said there's too many people. And that was a bestseller in 1969. It was a development of something called conservation biology that started to come into being in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And one of the fastest growing movements in the scientific community was something called conservation biology. Out of that idea came the idea of sustainable development, which was embraced by Gro Brundtland in 1987, publication of a book called Our Common Future. Now that book launched officially sustainable development. It was picked up in the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 in Rio de Janeiro and actually codified in Agenda 21. From there it grew to be the Millennium Goals around 2000, the future we want, and also the Agenda 2030 came out shortly after the 20th anniversary of that in 1992. It was called Rio Plus 20 in 2012 down in Rio de Janeiro. And from there grew the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we see prominently talked about today.
Here in the States, you have Agenda 30 by 30. Can you explain to the audience, what is that?
The 30 by 30 land grab is what we like to call it. This is an idea of taking 1/3 of the United States and essentially turning it into a national park. This has long been a goal of the Deep Green movement, dating back even to the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, when there was something put out called the Biodiversity Treaty, which also called for 1/3 of the Earth's habitat to be set aside for nature. This is all part of a deep green ecologist belief that there's too much development and that nature is best managed if we just take man out of the equation and leave it in its natural pristine state. So what we're seeing right now with the 30 by 30 is an effort to use existing laws and rules, whether it's WOTUS being one, the Endangered Species Act perhaps being another one, the roadless rule, which is prohibiting roads from going into wilderness areas, all designed to take man out of wilderness and even depopulate our rural areas and return it back to wilderness things. One thing they use is conservation easements. So what they'll do is they'll allow you to own it privately, but you sign an agreement with a green group, perhaps like the Nature Conservancy, and promise not to develop your land. But it's not just a promise you would make, it's for future owners of that land can no longer develop on it either.
So with Agenda 30 by 30 specifically, once they take this 30% of the land and devote it to wildness, what then? Are they done? Are they going to pack up and go home, or is there a next step? What do you think about that?
If they achieve trying to put 1/3 of the United States as a nature park, and they actually achieve their goal of 30% of the U.S. land into the wild, no, I don't think for a second they're going to stop there. The history has always been that with those on the left, that you give them an inch, they take a mile. So I would anticipate that some of the more, in fact, we see from some of the radical writings of those on the Green Movement that they're talking 50, 60, 70%. He was talking about radical reductions in population. I think it was Ted Turner who long ago said he'd like to see the world reduced to 500 million people. I mean, we're at 8 billion right now. So yes, I think among the more radical extreme Greens, they would like to see America as it was prior to 1492.
And so besides this land reclamation, there's more and more policies that are going into effect that have the climate as the basis for the reason for being. Like, for instance, there's a new policy of needing to put trackers inside of new vehicles after a certain year so that you can actually track how long you're driving for and where you are on the road. There's a move right now that was being discussed at the World Economic Forum of a system that could actually track an individual's carbon footprint, not a company's, but an actual individual's carbon footprint. What do you think the society would look like if all these policies were to actually go into effect and we continue down this road?
This whole idea of tracking individuals, I think, is very dangerous. I've been to some sustainable cities conferences. They actually exist and they meet every year. I've been to one in Melbourne, Australia. This goes back to maybe 2018 thereabouts, where Al Gore actually spoke at it. And essentially, they were lauding, again, communist China for tracking its citizens and having these surveillance cameras around town, and thinking of the various uses that this might provide for getting societies to become more green. You know, what if we put surveillance cameras and we see somebody throwing a plastic bottle into the regular garbage can instead of the recycling bin? Could we find him? You know, what if we see people that are driving the wrong sorts of vehicles? You know, the possibilities are endless in order to get a green, almost police state going. And that's something that was being talked about then. And, you know, so from my perspective, this is all consistent. We already have some credit card companies, I think it's MasterCard now, talking about a carbon footprint type credit card where when you charge too much for gasoline or too many plane flights or things that may emit too much carbons, they'll stop your credit card from working and you won't be able to do anything unless you purchase more credits, or maybe you just don't do anything for the rest of the month until you get your next allotment.
But is there any pushback on the other side saying, hey, the implementation of this would create an effective police state where people have to ask a bureaucrat to, you know, scratch their own heads? Is that even like a point of discussion at these conferences?
Is it a point of discussion that we might create a police state if we actually put all this together? I would say no. And I think the reason for that is most of the people attending these climate summits think they're exempt from any of the mandates that they're going to pass on to the rest of the people. They're a privileged elite. And so they take private jets to the UN conferences. They have champagne parties. They take private limos to the various events. And then they talk about, you know, what sort of restrictions need to go on for the rest of humanity. You won't see them taking public transportation. You won't see them eating meatless burgers, except for maybe a PR event. So no, I don't think that they actually think any of these things will affect them personally. I think the full intention behind all of these globalist policies is to rob the sovereignty of both the individuals and the nations around the world, and really put it under the authority of global elites. And so I think that that is the ultimate aim of all these things. People will be robbed of their sovereignty because they won't be able to choose what sort of meat they can eat, what temperature they can have in their own home. That'll be regulated. Smart meters, what type of cars they drive, how many children they have. All these types of things are incorporated in a very dangerous Agenda 2030 that I think people are largely ignorant of.